My name is Claire. I'm very excited to be here this evening. A couple months ago, I led the presentation called Gardening 101. Last month, I led my favorite presentation of gardening with kiddos, and this week, I present to you soil, soil, soil. We're learning all about what is under our feet and hopefully what will grow and produce your food in your garden. I obtained a degree in agriculture education, and so I was at Michigan State University studying all sorts of things, everything from potted plants to corn, soybeans, potatoes, dairy cows. I went abroad, studied some terraced farming, and now I've been working in the outdoor education world. So I've been working with kiddos and adults and just bringing them outside and making them more comfortable in camping settings or adventure settings or whatnot. So I'm excited to be here today. Currently I'm at the Chippewa Nature Center, and so here we go. Soils, soils, soils. Soil is your garden's foundation, much like a house's foundation, and it provides warmth, air, moisture, and nutrients to your plants. Hopefully today, by the time you leave, you will understand a little bit more about soil, be empowered to really discover your own soil, meet, greet it, get to know it as a friend, and also be able to support your plants and give them the warmth, air, water, and nutrients that they need. So let's get started. Oh, and also if you have any questions throughout, please just raise your hand. Soil, when you dig a hole, can be seen, different types of soil can be seen in different soil horizons. So at the very top, we have an O horizon, and that stands for organic. And that's where a lot of the loose and partly decayed organic matter is. This is the thinnest layer of the soil. Underneath the O layer is the A layer, and that's also known as the surface layer of the soil, which is a little confusing because technically the O layer is on the surface, but stay with me. The surface layer of the soil has mineral matter that's mixed with humus. So humus is your really dark, rich organic matter, and in the A layer you have minerals, which are also nutrients, and that humus mixed together. Below that you have B, also known as the subsoil, and that's where clay accumulates, and there's also leaching that occurs. So if you have something on the top of your soil, it might leach down into the B layer or the subsoil layer. Under the B horizon, we have C, which is basically, it's called the subterranean, and it is the parent material that's kind of crushed up. And so on the bottom is R, and that's the parent, like bedrock material. So we've got our bedrock material, and then some of it is like crushed up and mixed in, and we've got that C layer, and then B is clay, the accumulation of different leaching as well. So we've got the soil horizons. There are many soil maps. The USDA has a map that actually talks about like the hardiness of plants and where, like what zone you're in depending on what your zip code is. This map specifically is about the soils in our area. So if you can see, I put a black dot in the Midland area, and the black dot overlaps a tan color, yellow, a pink, and a red color as well. So I wrote a couple notes about those. Alpha sols are very high in fertility, specifically native fertility, so plants that are native to this area, and they're typically found beneath forests, and they're high in clay. So if you live somewhere that used to be a giant forest and you have a lot of clay, you probably live in an area that has alpha sol soil. There's also entosols. This has the least little profile development. So on the last slide you saw A, B, C. The entosols don't have as defined like profile, so they're like more mixed in, and they're common in floodplains or dunes. Now, even though Michigan does have some dunes, I think in this area the entosols that we're seeing are in floodplains. Insectosols are just beginning their soil profile. So if you dig down and you're like, wow, I don't see an O or an A or a B, and I'm seeing a lot of the same color underneath my soil, you're probably looking at some insectosols because they don't have a defined soil profile yet. Last but not least in this area, mollisols, humus accumulation, so really dark organic matter, and they're under native grasses. So if your home is in a place that used to be a grassland or a meadow, this might be the soil that you have, and it's thick and dark, and it has a really prominent A horizon. All right, so maybe you're under the forest, maybe your soil was under grassland at one time, maybe when you dig a hole you don't see any of the horizons, but this is just kind of what's going on in this specific area. On this picture, you can see clay, silt, sand, and loam. Loam is pictured in the middle because it is a combination of sand, silt, and clay. So that's what they look like in piles, but we're going to talk about them a lot more. Also clay, I find that clay sometimes looks like a light grayish as well. It's not always that red. In college, when I took soil class, I took 2 soils classes, and this was super important. Today we won't be like using the numbers, but if I go back, you can see sand, silt, clay, and loam. And on this picture, in the triangle, the sand, silt, clay, and loam are in the same spots on the triangle. And there are numbers here. So if you have 70% silt and 30% sand and let's say 20% clay, you'll have a silt loam. And so this is like, if you send your soil in to get it tested, they might give you a percentage and give you like a title, like your soil is silt loam and it has this percentage of sand, silt, and clay. And so we're going to talk about how to identify sand, silt, and clay today, but I just wanted to give us the background information. The biggest ball you're seeing on the projector right now is gravel. Hopefully your garden is not full of gravel. But down from that is sand. Sand is one of the biggest particles that you'll have, unless you have rocks or some sort of mineral that's bigger than sand. But we've got sand is the biggest particle. Silt is a lot smaller than sand. You can barely see it, but it's still there. And clay doesn't even show up on this reading. So I like to think of like a sand particle would be as big as a beach ball. And then a silt particle might be as big as a golf ball. And then clay would be like a tiny piece of dust. And when you are working with your soil, you might notice that the different types of soil, so sand, silt, or clay, feel different. They act different in situations where there's water or nutrients and things like that. And so it's good to know the sizes. Know your soil structure. If you've been listening to this so far and you're like, I have no idea what's in my garden, this is a handy test. In this jar on the screen, we have an example of sandy soil. I actually brought an example of this last time I was here, but I had a big jar, and I took some scoops of soil and put it in the jar with some water, and then I shook it. And then I also drove down a bumpy road, and by the time I got here, I put it on the counter, and it settled out. And because the sand particles are the biggest, they'll settle at the very bottom. And the sand settles in like 1-2 minutes, pretty soon. The silt will layer on top of the sand because it's the next biggest particle, and that might take 1 or 2 hours. So this is a good project to do if you want to shake up the jar with the water and the soil and then just let it sit for like a day. On top of the silt, the clay will eventually rest. Hopefully you use a clean water, like a tap water or something, and when that water is crystal clear, you'll know that all of your sediment has settled. The reason why this jar is sandy soil is because it has mostly sand. So if you look at the bottom, we've got sand, silt, and clay labeled, but the majority of it is sand. So if you do this with your soil and there's only a little bit of sand and then, mostly clay, for example, then you would have a clay soil. These different types of soils also have different textures, so they are different in size and texture. So sand, gritty like a beach. Silt can be kind of smooth, and then clay feels slippery when it's wet, and when it's dry, it's really, really hard and crusty. Okay, I see people taking notes. I will pause here for a moment. Has anybody done this before? Awesome. Do you know what type of soil you were? Sand? Okay. Oh, wow. Awesome. Yeah, well, and sometimes like when they dig out houses and they dig out foundations, they'll take out sand, silt or clay, and then they'll put in something else from like a totally different area. So then all of a sudden you go to make your garden and you're like, what the heck is all of this? It's not native to this area at all. And there are big deposits of sand, so like the sand dunes that you're talking about around here. Yeah. Okay, sand. Some plants love it, and some plants just can't tolerate it. If you try to plant certain vegetables or certain shrubs in sand, you will have no luck because sand is not very great at retaining water. I have a plus sign and a minus sign on many of these slides. Plus is a positive attribute, and a minus stands for a negative. I don't tend to label things good and bad, but in this situation, it's good to know what you're getting into if you have a lot of sand. So a positive of sand is that it drains easily and pretty quickly. It's easy to work through, so if you want to dig or move some soil around, sand is way easier than some of that really sticky clay that you might run into. And it warms up quickly in the spring. So those are some positives. Some negatives of sand is that it doesn't really hold moisture because it's so good at draining. It actually doesn't hold moisture very well at all. And so you'll have to frequently water your plants if you have a sand bed. It's also not very great at holding nutrients. So you'll have to add more fertilizer or organic matter. And it's also subject to wind and water erosion. So yeah, if you're not in a place with trees or shrubbery, your sand could go all over the place and move like a dune. But with all of these soils, there are things that you can do to amend them. So if you have only sand, you can still make a garden, but you'll have to add some things. So my highest recommendation for sandy soil is adding organic matter. Some examples can be topsoil, humus, mushroom compost, also known as mycelium, peat moss, and etc. So whatever type of organic matter you come across, maybe it's grass, maybe it's leaves, maybe you are collecting compost in your own kitchen, you can add these things to your sandy soil to add water retention and nutrient retention. The trick is to add 3 or 4 inches on the surface and then incorporate it into the soil. So you're going to put a layer on the surface of your sandy soil, and then you can kind of stir it in. If you're using compost, make sure that it's cured before you use it. We're not putting straight eggshells and banana peels into the garden. We're going to wait for them to compost and do their thing and break down and decompose. A note, if you have an excessive amount of manure that you want to use, especially if it's like fresh manure, be careful because it can really raise the salt and nutrient levels, making it actually bad for plants. So whatever you do it in moderation. Silt is the next type of soil that we'll be talking about. A positive of silt is that it does retain water a lot better than sand. It's easy to work with as well, and it does retain nutrients. A downside of silt, if you have a lot of it, it is subject to wind and water erosion. It does have slow draining, and it's easily compacted. So if you're walking around and you don't have paths in your garden, be careful because all that pushing down can actually compact and take out the aeration that you're really hoping for in a healthy garden. If you have silt soil, you can amend or help your silt soil out by fixing some drainage issues, right? So it retains water, it doesn't shed water. And so you can mix in mulches, fertilizers, and you can also add in some sand as well. So sometimes if you have silt, you might want a little bit of sand because sand doesn't retain water, right? So think about the particle sizes and what soil is best for what, and hopefully you'll have a mix in your garden and you won't just have one or the other. Everything in moderation. Extremes can be pretty crazy in a garden. You can till to the depth of 1 foot, add a layer of whatever help or amendment you want to make to the soil. So if you chose mulch, you'll till down to 1 foot, you'll add your mulch, and then you'll till that mulch into the soil, for example. If this process is conducted in the fall, improvements should be apparent in the spring. So if you do this in the fall after you harvest, and you add in mulch or dried leaves or some fertilizer, in the spring you should say, wow, my garden's never looked this good. Hopefully. Clay, and then after clay we have one more. Clay. If you're not sure you have clay, does your soil stick to the shoes or your garden tools? If you're walking around after a rain and you all of a sudden have stilettos on the bottom of your feet, you might have clay because it's super, super sticky. Does your soil crust over when it's wet? So if you go outside and you're seeing something that looks like a desert in front of you, you might have clay. Not a sandy desert, but like a crusty pieces of like soil that it's like sectioned off. You'll have clay. And if you pick up the soil and you squeeze it in your hand and then you let go, do you still have a chunk of clay in your hand, right? If you pick up a handful of sand and you squeeze it and you open your hand, the sand will just fall out. But if you have clay, you can pick it up, squeeze it, and it'll actually show the imprints in your fingers if it's like 100% clay. I have some papers here. I'd encourage you to take a picture if you want to do this on your own, but you'll pick up a handful of soil. It can be anywhere, but since we're talking about gardening, preferably in your garden. And these papers, they're both the same, but this paper has questions on it. And so the first question is, does your soil remain in a ball when you squeeze it? No, it prompts you one way. Yes, it prompts you another way. And eventually you'll get down to maybe creating a ribbon with your soil. So maybe you can push and maneuver your soil out of your hand and actually create different shapes. That's clay. But if you can't, then it's something else. So please take a picture. I'm going to put them one over here and one over here. Feel free. It's also a fun activity to do with kiddos. So if you want to get any grandchildren or children interested in working in your garden, you can do this little science experiment and take some notes. Clay. Positives of clay. Retains moisture. Yes, retains a lot of moisture. Very small particles, not a lot of room for the water to move around them. It's nutrient rich, oftentimes, and because the clay itself actually has a negative charge, and it attracts other nutrients like calcium, potassium, and magnesium. And so the clay is negatively charged. All things want to be at equilibrium, and so other nutrients that are positively charged run to the clay. If you're in a place that doesn't have calcium, potassium, or magnesium, then you might not have nutrient-rich clay, but for the most part, it's all right. The negatives or the downsides of having clay. Slow draining, slow to warm up in the spring. So if you're hoping to plant really early in the spring, you should mix in something like sand or organic matter to make it warm up a little bit faster. Compaction, that walking around that we talked about, or like pushing equipment can also compact clay soil. Ground heave in winter. So because it holds a lot of water, the water will freeze over the winter time, and ice takes up more room than water, and so it creates a little dome on top of the surface, and that's called a heave. So clay soil will often heave. If you have seen this maybe on a sidewalk or a driveway, where all of a sudden in the wintertime your driveway starts lifting up a little bit, and you really hope it doesn't crack, that's called a heave. So clay soil will oftentimes heave in winter. It's really hard to work with, much harder to work with than sand. It's hard for plants to grow through, so the roots have a tough time breaking through that really dense clay if that's your situation, and it becomes very hard when dry. But have no fear, there's something you can do. You can add organic matter, and you can also add sand. So there's clay on one side, sand on the other. If you've got all clay, add a little sand. If you've got all sand, you can add a little clay if you need to, but that'll help even out the water retention. It is tough to do, but you should mix things into your clay soil. This improves the structure. In the end, it makes it easier to work with. It helps with drainage and nutrient benefits, and it also increases aeration. Since those clay particles are so small, they're really packed in there. And so there's not a lot of room for water or air. And so the more you add to it, the more organic matter, a little bit of sand you add to it, it mixes up those clay particles and makes it easier to work with in the end. Claire, how much organic matter do I add? Do I just go for it and, obtain some and then dump it all on? Well, my advice is to follow the 25 to 50% ratio rule. You can use compost, straw, wood bark, leaves. We'll talk about different types of organic matter later. But if you have a heavier, harder clay, you could increase this percentage a little bit. But what you want to do is add a bunch of organic matter to the top of your garden, and then it'll actually create a raised bed, right? If you pour organic matter on the top of your clay, you'll have like a little pile of organic matter, and that raised bed can actually be helpful when it comes to drainage because that water will run off. But mix organic matter at least a 25 to 50% ratio with the clay. So if you've got 2 pounds of clay, add 2 or a little bit less of whatever you choose to use. And loam. If you have loam, you have a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. That will be found in the middle of our triangle that I showed you with all the numbers, and also the middle of that picture that I showed you. It's ideal for gardening because it is good at retaining water and nutrients, and it still allows the water to flow, so the particles aren't too tightly packed. So water still gets to flow in, but nutrients are held on. Loam, sand, silt, and clay, 40, 40, 20. That equals 100%. And if you have different portions of sand, silt, and clay, you can have a sandy loam or a silty loam or like a sandy clay loam. You don't have to get too worried about it, but I'm just letting you know that if you go in and you say, I have a loam, somebody might say, well, what kind of loam do you have? And then you have to think, well, do I have mostly sand and a little bit of the others? Then you might have a sandy loam. The positives of a loam, it contains humus, so it has that really deep, dark organic matter. It is good for drainage, and it's very easy to till. It's got a lot of aeration. It's not as compact as the clay. And then some negatives of loam, you can lose these qualities when the soil isn't treated properly, and so you can have compaction if you don't have pads and if you walk everywhere on your soil. You can deplete the organic matter if you're not adding in as you're harvesting crops, right? So if you grow the most beautiful, magnificent tomato plants, and then you take all the tomatoes off and you put them in the kitchen, and then you pull up all the plants at the end of the year and you put them in your compost pile or whatever, all that nutrients from the tomatoes and from the plant are actually not in the soil anymore. So if you don't replenish that, if you don't replenish your nutrients, you could lose your beautiful loam soil. And it does have clay dispersed throughout it. So be aware that loam does have clay, and that clay is really high in retaining water and also has those nutrients. But it's good to be aware of what sand, silt, and clay all bring to the table so that if you have a mix, you know what to do. Test your soil. There's many places that you can go and get a test, but the main reasons why you want to test is for nutrients and also pH levels in your garden. So I have a link here, and I'll bring you over to my alma mater, MSU. MSU has a great soil testing center. Somebody earlier mentioned that they might go to Meyer and get their soil tested. Yeah, but you can go wherever as long as it's like a reputable source. MSU has an easy get started. You can just Google like MSU soil test, and it'll be like one of the first links. And it goes through exactly what you need to do. And it looks like here it'll cost you $25 with some shipping and handling. It's best to do this where you have some buffer time. So if you want to get your soil tested right now, you totally can, but you might not get the results back in time to really make a huge difference for your garden this year. Did you have a question?
A few years back, they were like selling the kits for them.
Oh, awesome.
Are they still good to just mail in? Could you buy them and then mail them in? Do you know?
I'm not familiar with that system. Do you know, Marcia?
I remember like when they first closed the extension kind of closed down from what it was, so they weren't taking the still closed at the county.
Yeah.
But you could buy the soil.
And you could send it in yourself.
Yeah, what else I don't know. I still have a couple of them, and I don't think they're any good anymore. If you go to this website and you download their forms, you can fill out the form, follow the directions, put all your soil together like you're supposed to, put it in your Ziploc bag, go to the post office, get a box, and mail it to MSU. Okay, I understand that, but I paid to have it. I have all that forms and stuff with it. We bought the soil test. Yeah, it's back on. Yeah, things are okay, awesome. The world is changing. All right.
Yeah. If you figure it out, you can always put a little post and say, hey, I figured it out.
Yeah, because I have two of them at home that I haven't used, and I don't know if they're good in my house.
Yeah. Since MSU Extension it is closed, may or may not be closed. Yeah. Oh, okay. But you might just be able to call and leave a message, and they may be able to answer your question. So, yeah.
Call, leave a message, and somebody will call you back. At the Midland Extension? At the Midland Extension.
Okay, perfect. I also have another link pulled up here. It's actually the soil survey of Midland County, and this is back in I think 1975. I was looking through it a couple days ago. You can actually just find it, soil survey of Midland online. But it's a very lengthy document, but it's really rich in history. So if you're wondering what exact piece of land you're on and what it looked like back then and what was going on, you can figure it all out in this soil survey. I found that the maps aren't the maps look a lot different than they do today. But it did talk about glacial till, that soil survey. There was a map of where glacial till was dropped off and deposited, so where you'll find a lot of gravel, and then those big pockets of sand that were on the side of the glacier. You'll have those big piles of sand. So you can kind of see, the land formation and how it really lines up with the geography of Midland. Minerals. Minerals come from rocks. So I did this project with a group of kiddos the other day. I had a jar of green beads, and I said, these green beads are minerals. And if you have green beads and red beads and purple beads, those are all different types of minerals. And when you put them all together, you get a rock. And so rocks and minerals are different. Minerals make up rocks, and minerals can come from rocks via physical or chemical or biological breakdown, and they add nutrients to your soil. So the three magic nutrients that people are most familiar with are NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen promotes strong stems and leaves, contributes to the dark, healthy color of those plants in your garden. Phosphorus is needed for early growth, so springtime or early summer, and it promotes strong roots, fruit, and seed formation. And as a gardener, you probably want strong roots, delicious fruits, and also seeds as well, so you can continue your garden for the next year. And also potassium, or K. We are talking not exactly about bananas, but the potassium in bananas. And it can improve and help your garden fight off diseases, and it can also help with stress resistance, and it enhances the flavor of fruits and vegetables. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are important for your soil. If you send in a soil test and you figure out that you are deficient in either N, P, or K, there are fertilizers that you can use to help add in more of whatever nutrient you need. And we also have the option to add in organic matter or other types of additives as well. I'll talk about that in a second. Correcting mineral deficiency. You can use deep-rooted plants to actually mine for the nutrients. So think back to the beginning of the slides. There were the soil horizons. If you plant a plant that has really deep roots, they can go through the O, A, and B layers and actually reach some of that bedrock or the minerals down below. And those deep-rooted plants, for example, stinging nettle, can actually bring those nutrients more towards the surface. There are also some plants like legumes that are really great at fixing nitrogen. So if you're really down in nitrogen, you can actually plant a plant that will bring in more. If you need nitrogen, you can add composted manure. You can do green manure as well, so that's like a cover crop. And you can plant, nitrogen-fixing plants. If you need phosphorus, you can use bone meal. Potassium, you can use coffee grounds, fruit compost, and some ashes. So if you're burning wood, and you can look it up online, but some wood is higher in potassium than others, so you can actually use some of the ashes from your stove or your fire in your garden. But do the research, and everything in moderation. Oh, and rock powder. Rock powder is like ground up rock, as it sounds, and since minerals provide nutrients, and rock is made of minerals, rock powder is good for adding nutrients as well. Testing pH. I know that we're running a little bit slow on time, so I'm not going to have everybody, Are we in a hurry? I have an option to do a pH test. I have some water right now. I'll just save it till the end. If you want to do a pH test and see how to dip the thing in the water and then compare the strip will change color, and you can actually compare it to the pH scale that I have behind me, and you can see if the water that we're testing is acidic, neutral, or basic.
How much soil do you have to put in with the water and you mix it up to get that test?
Yeah, if you're using a soil, you just need a little bit. Can you see my cursor? Yeah, just a little bit. Today I just have water. If you're testing soil, you'll use a solution, not a water solution, but a solution that won't affect the pH reading. Does that make sense? Because like this water might be, a 7 or an 8 on the scale. Yeah, they'll give you a solution. Actually, here in this picture, there is a tester solution. So you'll just put the solution in with the soil, and the solution itself will change color. Okay. If you need to increase your garden soil, my recommendation is limestone. As you can see, oh, that's weird that it's cut off. Okay, loam, sandy, clay, those are the words on the side. But my recommendation is limestone if you need to increase your pH. So if you find on your chart that you have more acidic soil, so like 3, 4, 5, there are some plants that don't like to grow in that zone. And so you'll want to bring it up to like a 6 or 7. And so you can add limestone. And if you want to lower the pH, my recommendation is sulfur. If you want to take a picture of this slide, you're more than welcome to on my computer where the words aren't cut off. But it talks about the very specifics of loam, silt, and clay. Here is a visual to show you what kinds of vegetables or fruits you can grow in certain pHs. So you can see here that potatoes like to be between 5-ish and 6.5, while lettuce is 6 to 7. So if your pH is showing that you have acidic soil, so let's say you have a 5, if you have a 5 acidic soil on the pH scale, you'll have a tough time growing lettuce because lettuce likes to grow in the 6 or 7 range on the pH scale. So depending on the pH and the type of soil you have, different fruits and vegetables will be either happy or unhappy. Acidic soil, these vegetables over here would be lower on the scale. So potatoes, blueberries, strawberries are over here, and like the 4s and 5s and 6s, while alkaline is the basic. So if you're on the other side of the scale, like 7, 7.5, you'll grow a lot of greens like broccoli, cauliflower, asparagus. Mulching. Mulching helps retain moisture. It can add nutrients and it can be super beneficial for your garden. Some inorganic mulches can be rocks, gravels, or pebbles. They come in all shapes and sizes. For a vegetable garden, I wouldn't recommend rocks, but if you're growing shrubbery or something, you could use rocks. Some inorganic mulch can be like a plastic tarp you put over your vegetables or right on the ground, and that can help warm up the soil if the tarp, for example, is black, so that when the sun is shining on your black tarp in the early spring, it can help warm up your soil. So if you've got clay soil that stays colder for longer, you might want to consider some plastic mulch or some rubber. My overall recommendation is always opting for an organic mulch if you can, and that can be leaves, straw. I have pictures of pine bark, pine needles, cedar. You can also use just lawn clippings. So if you have like really tiny sticks that went through some, not mulcher, but I guess like the lawnmower or whatever. Hopefully not your lawnmower, but anyway, you can use organic matter that's all crushed up and you can use it as mulch. Cedar mulch is actually a natural insect repellent, and it has a pleasant fragrance. So take a look at what's best for you. I know that pine needles can be used as mulch, but they're pretty acidic. So if you want to grow, again, some greens like lettuce, maybe don't put pine needle mulch because pine needles are better for acidic plants like potatoes. So consider what kind of mulch is best for you, organic or inorganic, and then go down from there. You can also use newspaper shreddings, paper bags. You can visit the local tree service. I know the horticulture department sometimes have scraps, and you can maybe get some mulch from there as well. For mulch, if you go to the store and you're like, I need some mulch, and you're like, I need 1 bag. I probably need 3 bags. I've realized that anytime I go to get mulch, I never have enough. And so what you'll want to do is measure the width and multiply it by the length of your garden to get the square footage of your space. So that when you go to wherever you're going to get your mulch, you're like, I need 50 square feet of this type of mulch that I've decided on. Then you make sure to prepare your soil. Please pull up all the weeds. Mulch can deter weeds from growing, but they don't deter them if they're already there. So if you're going to mulch, pull the weeds out first, and then you can spread the mulch, leaving sections around your plant so that the water can still get to your plant, and you'll also want to water it down. So pick your mulch, buy the right amount, prepare the soil, spread and water. One of my favorite things, I studied this in school, there are critters in the soil. Some microinvertebrates, so animals without backbones that can only be seen under a microscope, actually are super beneficial to our soil. We've got animals that help break down soil, like earthworms, ladybugs, and roly-polies. Animals that aerate the soil, like ants. If you've ever seen a cross-cut of an ant farm, you might see all the little trails. Well, all those little trails are filled with air instead of soil, and so that increases the aeration. And mineralizing nutrients, so that breakdown of those rocks, protozoa. I have a picture of them on the next slide, but in 2 tablespoons of soil, there are more protozoa than any other human on Earth. So the protozoa population is really big. And then there's also some negatives over here, some negative critters. Nematodes can be positive or negative, but here I have them listed as a negative because they do burrow into plant tissue. And grubs, those white grubs that you might see, they love to eat roots. And if you're trying to grow beautiful plants, you probably want your root structures to stay intact. You can increase the bird activity, rotate crops, control your weeds, and use mid-season plowing to take care of some of these negative critters, or there's also like pesticides as well. Up here, this is called a space bear or a tardigrade. They've actually survived the space vacuum. They're really cool to look at under a microscope, and they're a positive because they help break down and add nutrients to the soil. They also help decompose, right? They're eating, and then they're leaving their waste in the soil. These are the nematodes that I was talking about. And these guys outnumber humans a bajillion to none, or 1, and they are protozoa. All of these need to be seen with a microscope, but they're pretty cool if you ever get the chance. Organic matter should be on the top 12 inches of your soil. So that's the O and A horizons that we saw in the beginning. It helps bind soil particles together, allowing water and air to flow. It also retains moisture, nutrients, and it's good for those microorganisms that we were just looking at. You can also use manure, chicken, cow, horse manure. Cover crops, you grow them, and then once they're fully grown, you can just rotate them into your soil. You can use clover, alfalfa, or rye, whatever you're looking for. And also compost. You can use food scraps, grass clippings, brush, things like that. My advice for somebody who is getting used to working with their soil is make permanent garden beds. If you move your garden beds every year, or if you pick a different spot in your yard every year, it's really hard to work with that same soil over and over again and really build really healthy soil. And if you have a permanent garden bed, you can also have paths, and this can help you not compact the soil as much. Where if you go willy-nilly all over the place, you'll be walking on your garden beds, and then you'll be squishing the soil down. Aeration is super important. You can double dig, use a broad fork, or you can also till. Double dig is when you dig out the soil, and then you dig out different soil and you put it in the hole that you just made, and then you put the other soil in the other hole, and so you're just kind of mixing it around. It's like a giant mixer, but with a shovel on your hands and knees. Water retention, super important. If you add organic matter, you can help with this. Also clay, but soil is your friend. You can create an understanding with your soil. So really get to know it, what kind you have, what is its nutrient level, what pH are you looking at, everything in moderation, and make friends with other people and ask tons of questions. You're all in the right spot to do that. Thank you and happy gardening. I got a lot of pictures that weren't mine, so here we go. Wabamo, wabamo, awesome. Thank you for being here. Again, there are books in the back. I will take as many questions as you have. Hopefully we can answer them all as a group because I may not be able to answer every single question. And I also have the pH test up here if you've never seen a piece of paper change color right before your eyes based on the pH of the water. Does anybody have any questions? No? No questions? Yes?
Pull down and on, and underneath that, how big is it? 12 by 24. It's going to be a lot of sand in there when we take that off. What do we do with all that sand?
Yeah, well, what we did on our farm, you can sell the sand. That's an option. Sand can sell at a pretty decent price, so if you're interested in doing that. You can also use that area for something that isn't your garden if you want to keep it on site. Does anybody have any other recommendations?
So, we wanted to make that into a garden.
Oh. Yeah, so I would maybe take some of the sand out just so that you have enough room to add more soil. And then I would go back and add some clay. Let's see. You can add some clay and some organic matter because that sandy area is really gonna not hold the water. The water is gonna run right through it. So you want something to help hold the water, and then you need something else to help hold the nutrients. And yeah, so clay, organic matter. Yeah, and you can go and find some fertilizer if that interests you. You just want to basically turn your pale looking sand that falls apart in your hands into something really dark and like rich in like color and organic matter. So if you pick up the soil and you smell it, you're like, wow, this smells like earth. Then you've got something right. If you pick it up and you're like, it doesn't smell like anything, that might be your sand.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Hello. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for starting late. So we have a trailer full of clay that we would love to trade you.
Awesome. Let's go back to that very last advice page. Make friends and ask questions. Ask questions, make friends.
I'll give you my phone number and name and everything.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Well, if you want to stay and chit-chat, you are more than welcome to. Oh, another question. Yes.
I have a couple of questions actually.
It's all right. What's up?
So our backyard is full of myrtle and also pine trees.
Ah,
I'm guessing that that's a really acidic place, and we're trying to clear that up as well. If anybody wants free myrtle, please come to our house to get them. But we were going to try to dig that up and make a garden too. So I'm thinking we were going to try to make raised beds because that's what everybody says is so good. But I don't know if we're going to be able to do that. So if you're not in a raised bed, trying to change that acidic soil that's been that way for years and years and years, how long is it going to take before we can grow the things that we want to grow?
does anybody have specific experience with this? Awesome. Would you like to share specific experience?
I do have pine trees and maples and sand, and all the research that I've done, basically, pine trees are shallow rooted, so, you know, they weren't just the roots, they're not too much. But everything that you can try to do to alter your soil pH doesn't last very long. So, a raised bed sounds like a good plan. That's just, you know, what I read, and that's been our experience. You can put all that sulfur down and want to grow azaleas, and 2 years later, it's back to whatever it was before. Okay. All right. I think the scientists all overshow it. Right, okay. But raised bed looks really, really good.
Yeah, they're really easy. You can buy the quarter and then just get the wood and slip it in the corner, so you don't have to like nail everything together. Oh, okay. Yeah, they have several different kinds of corners that you can get. You might get one from Home Depot. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Pallet tops,
Yeah.
the pine place. Yeah, you can look at the best and
And then for all the way there, and it wasn't that much more expensive than getting that.
No.
Really, was it?
No, what was, it's
Like $9 a bag, so.
well,
If you wanna do it.
you can get it in a trailer though, they'll load a trailer or something, if you want, if you need more than a bag. Yeah, they have piles.
Oh,
Out by their mall.
But is it really just manure or is it up there with the soil?
It's actually
It depends.
compost, it's composted manure.
Okay.
So it's already got the seeds on, all the seeds are gone.
That's really good, and they standardize their
Yeah. I like the
piles.
seed starting bags too, to start the seeds if you started seeds.
Oh, very nice.
I used to make my own, but it was, by the time I bought the bone meal and the blood meal and, everything, it was cheaper for me, easier to go.
They have it ready to go.
Probably was cheaper, but it
Well,
was
the reason I was asking is because you have friends that have a couple of horses, and I saw that you said that you could horse manure, so I was thinking,
it's really hot. It's really hot and has a lot of seeds in it. It has a lot of seeds in it.
okay, so skip that, okay.
So unless you composted it yourself, so that it got hot enough to kill all the seeds, you probably didn't have a lot of seeds.
And it doesn't kill poison ivy.
It was don't
I thought, well, it's not like
I would never get
I was pulling poison ivy out of the yard where I put the compost or the thing is.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
They were sprouting from the compost, yeah. So they, even though it had been hot composted, it didn't kill the poison ivy.
Whoa.
And I know it was from that because it was specifically in those spots, which I started watching for them. So as soon as they pop up, but it was probably 10 years that I was still finding the odd seed. And we never had any on the property, so I knew it wasn't, we didn't inherit it, it was new.
Wow.
I have a question, in all your, because you've done a lot of education with the soil and everything, if you've got like a floodplain that floods every year, you know what I'm saying? But then it dries out.
Yeah, you mean something that gets like so wet because it's like standing water for multiple days and then it just.
Well, we're on a river, so what happens is the ice backs up at a bridge,
Mhm.
and it backs all the way up, and then for like a day or more, or if it rains, could be a clay too, if it rains really hard. But about once a year, it actually, when the river comes up and goes down, like for a day.
Mm.
So it does wash a lot. You know what I'm saying? We are
So-
seeing a lot of.
Yeah, your question is like, what do you do to like have soil retention in that area since like.
There's
We don't know
plants
what's getting washed in.
washed in,
garden.
well, not so much, but that if you have, it's a field, it's got, plants, you know what I'm saying? It's
Right,
not
right.
a farm field, it's just a field.
Okay, yeah, like a
With
meadow.
grasses and flowers and
Mhm.
whatever.
Mhm.
Will that hold the soil in enough that it's not washing out the nutrients that are during that time?
Yeah, it really depends on how much coverage you have on that field that's nearby. And so if it's like all grass, then you're better off than like if it's no grass, right?
Right.
Because then you'll have, it's kind of like runoff. So you're asking like
Right.
what type of runoff you're getting on your property because of this flood.
Right.
Yeah, so it really depends on the vegetation that's on that area, and then also what they put on that land. So you said it's not a farm field, so they probably don't have.
It was a farm field, but it's not been planted for years and years, so it's all
Okay.
grasses and whatever comes, daisies and,
Yeah,
milkweed or whatever comes up.
right.
Right.
If it's flooding, then there's a potential to get those seeds on your property, for sure. I don't know what contamination you would have, like based on just having that like grassland right next to you. Has anybody else had this experience?
Well, I actually have a plot out there.
Oh, okay.
The
Interesting.
winter ride on it last year.
Oh, okay. So like a green manure. Okay.
In the
I
middle of that, so I can't plant till like, it's really too wet and clay, but
right.
I'm sure I know they used to farm it.
Right. I would say that like if it's all getting flooded out, whatever is over on that side is now like could be on your plot. And so you'll get like seeds and whatever critters are under the soil and whatever else came from up and down like upstream. Yeah.
So
I don't
really the soil could change year to year depending on what.
yeah, if it's all getting washed out,
Well, it doesn't really, I don't know. I'm sure some of it gets washed out.
Yeah.
The only way to know really is to get a soil test every year. Because you don't know what mineral or chemical is going to be deposited by the water. And you don't know what is actually going to be washed through the soil to a lower soil level because of all the water. Although if you're at the water table, there's going to be less minerals washing through. And you have a lot of, all of those plants that are planted there are not only taking out minerals, but they're providing minerals. So you already have a big support system there. But the only time you really have to worry about a lot of rain or water washing minerals and nutrients out of your soil is when you have a raised bed. Okay, so you have nothing covering the raised bed except your vegetables. The rain is going to come and it is going to go through that soil and out the sides of your bed and out the bottom of your bed. And that's when you're going to have nutrient loss from a lot of rain, not just in a field that's next to a river.
And then if you have a raised bed and all that water's coming through, the nutrients is leaving and nothing's really getting put back in because your bed is raised like that. So.
My mom, I was there today. She lives on where the dam broke, and and then she's trying to grow grass again, and it's that's why I love that from the lake is like hard to grow, right? And in the community garden, we take a soil test at least every other year, because, and especially last year because we had so much rain. We took it the year before, but we knew that we saw the same problems last year, so we knew we were nutrient deficient. So we went with the soil test that we had taken the year before. How did it turn out? How did you guys have to add a lot all the time? I don't remember, but it was low. I knew we were low in nitrogen because I have seen the growth, even though it's phenomenal. I've seen the growth go down because I'm there every year. So we knew we were low in nitrogen, and yes, we were. So are you adding, or do you just add compost? We give our soil test from MSU to Morgan's composting. Okay. And they create a special mixture for us for the community garden. Okay. And we have it trucked in. I like those people. They're nice. And it's also a nice little road trip. Oh, and I love your store. It's awesome. I know. I see those ads all the time, and it's just like, wow, I didn't know they had that. And if you can ever take a tour, you'll learn a lot about soil and compost. If you can get there on one of their, I think they call it an open house day or something like that. Morgan's compost. It's in Sears, Michigan. It's just northwest of Cadillac. Not Cadillac. Claire. Yeah.
Very good.
Very good. And I think they're still growing mushrooms. I saw them. They do vermiculture, and so they're expanding what they carry to help you amend your soil. Because I don't see a change year to year, because it does it every year, and I know what it is, and I add to each hole when I plant a plant. There goes in some compost, and I mix some stuff. If I have a lot of rain or if I get a flood, then I add some gypsum or calcium.
Good.
Because tomatoes need it, for the fruits and stuff, and that seems to help. But I was just curious, because
That's a lot of water. Yeah, and we only see the water on the top of the soil, but because it's not draining, all the water is also underneath the ground as well. So, yeah, I'm glad you take those steps. Question, and then you in the back, but let's start up here.
So it's with mulch, and I'm going to mulch question. So
Okay.
if I'm planting from seed, should I wait to mulch so that I'm not hindering the little seedlings?
Yeah, so I don't know, are you starting your seeds inside?
I have some that I'm starting inside, but mostly it would be just seed in the ground.
Okay, yeah. So once they like harden and they're like blowing in the breeze, you can add that mulch. But if you put mulch down before they start coming up, that mulch can actually block them. And so like as your plants are trying to come up, you'll have like the mulch can get in the way. But if you have like a light mulch, like a mycelium, straw, yeah, the plants will be able to come up no problem, as long as it's not like super thick. Yeah, and you can also water it as well, so that the mulch doesn't blow away if it gets windy.
Or you can use a row cover.
Mm-hmm.
A row cover, you can use a row cover to protect your seeds while they're germinating. That helps too.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
Okay, the birds, two questions. One is, we do have a lot of ants, and we didn't know that they were good for the soil. So we always were spraying stuff or putting powder down to make the ants go away. But they leave these little sandy hills all over
Mm-hmm.
the yard or whatever. So, when we don't put powder down, we have a whole bunch of those northern clippers that,
Yeah.
But other than those, so I guess I'm wondering, do I want to keep the anthrax in the ground?
If you have an excess amount of ants that are bringing up a lot of sand and they're eating your fruits and vegetables, you should take care of the ants and try to lessen them, but don't eradicate all of the ants. Everything. I'll say it again. Everything in moderation. So some ants are good, but if you look out in your yard and you can practically see them parading, you're going to want to put some powder or something down, just because at that point they're like a nuisance. But yeah, try to keep some of them around if possible.
Okay, so then the other thing is that you said for grubs, we have skunk holes all over here. I know we have tons of grubs and we see them all the time, but the trouble with it is we used to have lots and lots of birds, but now we have these little traps that crawl around, and I just think that they decrease in the birds. So is there anything I can do about that?
Yeah. Well.
We had one family that moved in, and they had like 2 cats, and within 5 years, I can't even catch me again on the cat.
The other problem is that ant powders kill
Beneficial.
They kill the beneficial insects, which the birds eat, and now we're losing our songbirds that eat insects because we've been killing all our insects. So yeah, I know too many ants is too many, but they also eat grubs. So or kill the grubs. It does seem to discourage them because we use that around our house, but we cover it with mulch so that the birds and the dogs don't get it. It's like a very sharp.
I have a whole bunch of it, and I used to put it around my process, like I used to put it around the rooms of hospice when they keep on to try to get a sludge on them. But then someone told me, don't ever use that in your garden, and so
Actually, taro works really good for ants.
That's poison.
Not for people on top.
Isn't that poisonous to dogs?
What?
Taro.
Taro.
The only time I don't like it in my kitchen, so I will do something there in the kitchen.
So the only thing that I use outside of it is taro, and they actually have it in little housing. So the ants get in there, and then they get it on their bodies, and they carry it back to the nest, and that, or it keeps it in the.
these were some of our moles.
Because we don't want them in the ground or anything.
That'll get rid of some of our grubs.
Okay, might try to get that. Anywhere. So there are minor, just look for taro.
I've been having trouble planting it in stores, so
There's a lot of this right now.
Also for grubs, if you want to get rid of grubs, milky spore is a good natural control for disease and pests. And it lasts for like 10, 20, 30 years. It's like, it's really, once you put it down, it seems to be pretty good.
Okay, and then, I'm sorry, I have a ton of questions, so, does anybody else want to ask more questions before I ask more? Okay, so first of all, did you have anything else to say about cats and birds? I thought you looked like you were going to say something.
No, I agree with everything they said. And if you want to increase birds on your property, you can put up birdhouses, but they've got it.